Welcome back to Engaging Thought, everyone. I'm Andre, and as always, I'm joined by Eric Marquette. Today, we're diving into the wild, sometimes messy world of leading change in social justice movements. Eric, you ready to get into the weeds?
Oh, absolutely, Andre. I mean, this is a topic that's been evolving so fast, especially in the last decade. When you look at movements like Black Lives Matter or March for Our Lives, the expectations on leaders are just, well, they're all over the place. There's this pressure to be both the face of the movement and, at the same time, to build these really robust democratic structures. It's a balancing act, right?
Yeah, and it's not just about being the loudest voice in the room. There's this tension between the need for strong, visible leadership, what some folks call the heroic leader model, and the reality that real change usually comes from collective action. I mean, we've seen this in schools, nonprofits, even in corporate DEI work. Leaders are expected to be saviors, but that can actually undermine the whole point of social justice, which is about shared power and inclusion.
Right. And the media doesn't always help. I've covered stories where the narrative is all about the one charismatic leader, like the warrior who's fighting the system. But as we've seen in research, especially that study on Mrs. D, sometimes that heroic framing can actually backfire. It puts all the pressure on one person, and it can leave the rest of the team feeling sidelined or even alienated.
Exactly. And it's not just the external pressure either. Leaders are juggling expectations from their own teams, from allies, from the broader community. Sometimes those expectations are in direct conflict, like your staff wants more voice, your funders want quick results, and the community wants to see real, lasting change. It's a lot to hold, and honestly, it's easy to slip into that I have to fix everything myself mindset.
Yeah, and that's where things can get tricky. I mean, if you're always the one winning the battle, you might actually be shutting out the people who need to be part of the solution. We saw that with Mrs. D. Her intentions were good, but by centering herself as the model, she ended up excluding teachers and even parents from the process. That's a tough lesson for any leader.
And it's not just in education. We've seen similar patterns in other movements too. There's this urge to find the next face of the movement, but real progress comes from building systems where everyone has a stake. I think, as we've talked about in previous episodes, especially when we discussed allyship and systemic change, it's about moving from that hero mindset to a more collaborative, sustainable approach.
Totally. And the evolution of leadership roles in these movements is fascinating. Black Lives Matter, for example, has really pushed back against the idea of a single leader. They've tried to keep things decentralized, which has its own challenges, but it's a conscious choice to avoid those pitfalls of hero worship. Same with March for Our Lives. There's a lot of effort to keep the movement broad and inclusive, not just about a handful of spokespeople.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into our next topic. What does true inclusivity actually look like in practice? Because it's one thing to say you want to be inclusive, but it's another to actually build it into your leadership and your organization. Let's get into that.
So, Andre, when we talk about inclusivity, I think a lot of folks imagine it's just about having a diverse group of people in the room. But as we've seen with groups like the National Domestic Workers Alliance or the Sunrise Movement, it's way more than that. It's about making sure marginalized voices are actually heard and have real influence at every level of leadership.
Absolutely. And, I've seen this firsthand in my HR work. It's not enough to just invite people to the table. You have to make sure they feel safe enough to speak up and that their perspectives actually shape decisions. I remember this one time I was working with an organization that was struggling to engage their staff of color. We set up affinity groups, and honestly, it was eye-opening People shared things they'd never felt comfortable saying in the larger group. It surfaced a lot of perspectives that leadership had been missing entirely.
That's such a good point. And, sometimes organizations fall into the trap of tokenism. Like, hey, we've got one person from this background, so we're good. But that's not real inclusion. If that person doesn't feel empowered to challenge the status quo, or if they're always expected to speak for their entire community, it's just another form of exclusion.
Yeah, and it can be subtle too. Sometimes leaders think they're being inclusive by modeling the right behavior, but if they're always the one setting the standard, like Mrs. D did, placing herself as the model, it can actually shut down other voices. People start to think, well, I can, well, I can't live up to that, or my perspective isn't valued here. Like, it's a real pitfall, and it's easy to miss if you're not paying attention.
And it's not just about internal dynamics either. I mean, look at the Sunrise Movement. They've made a point of bringing in young people from all kinds of backgrounds and giving them real leadership roles. But even they've had to wrestle with how to avoid replicating the same old power structures. It's a constant process of listening, learning, and adjusting.
Exactly. And sometimes you have to be willing to face conflict head on. I think about that Atlantic Fellows program we read about, where they realized they weren't actually connecting people across differences. They were just reinforcing the same silos. It wasn't until they leaned into those uncomfortable conversations that real growth happened. Inclusivity isn't always comfortable, but it's necessary if you want to build something sustainable.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of organizations get stuck. They want the benefits of diversity, but they're not always ready for the hard work of actually sharing power. It's messy, it's slow, and sometimes it means letting go of control. But as we've seen, that's where the real change happens.
And it's ongoing, right? Like, you don't just arrive at inclusivity. It's something you have to keep working at, keep reflecting on, and sometimes you're going to mess up. I mean, I've made mistakes, plenty of them, but the key is to stay humble, keep listening, and be willing to change course when you realize you're not actually living up to your values.
That's so true. And I think that's a good lead-in to our last big topic for today: how leaders can build resilience, both for themselves and their organizations, so they can keep pushing for change even when things get tough. Let's talk about that.
So, resilience, I feel like this is the part nobody really wants to talk about, but it's absolutely critical. Social justice work is hard. There are setbacks, there's burnout, and sometimes it feels like you're just banging your head against the wall. But if leaders don't take care of themselves and their teams, the whole thing can fall apart.
Yeah, and it's not just about self-care, though. That's a big piece. I mean, you look at grassroots groups and established nonprofits. What sets the resilient ones apart is that they build in support systems. They create space for people to process, to rest, to reconnect with the bigger vision. I think about what Tarana Burke and Dolores Huerta have said about sustaining movements. It's about staying committed even after the protests die down and making sure people don't burn out before the real work is done.
Exactly. And, sometimes resilience means being willing to adapt. Take Stacey Abrams's campaigns in Georgia. She faced setback after setback, but she kept going, kept organizing, kept building coalitions. And eventually that persistence paid off in a huge way. But it wasn't just about her. It was about building a movement that could outlast any one person or election cycle.
That's such a great example. And it ties back to what we talked about earlier, moving away from the heroic leader model. If everything depends on one person, the movement is fragile. But if you build systems, relationships, and a culture of shared leadership, you can weather the storms. You can keep moving forward, even when things get tough.
And I think that's the lesson for anyone trying to lead change, whether you're in a school, a nonprofit, or a grassroots movement. You have to invest in your own resilience, but also in the resilience of your team. That means making space for reflection, for learning from mistakes, and for celebrating the small wins along the way. It's not glamorous, but it's what keeps the work going.
Yeah, and honestly, it's what makes the difference between a movement that fizzles out and one that actually changes things. So, as we wrap up, I guess the big takeaway is leadership in social justice isn't about being the hero. It's about building something bigger than yourself, something that can last. And that takes resilience, humility, and a whole lot of listening.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Eric. Thanks for joining me in this conversation, and thanks to everyone listening. We'll be back next time to dig even deeper into these topics. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other.
Thanks, Andre. Always a pleasure. See you next time, everyone.